All right, so ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you can all see me. I'm rocking the COVID haircut. I haven't yet managed to go to the hairdresser, so that's why I'm looking like this. But actually, I'm going to be sharing with you a presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. It would be great if someone could confirm that actually my screen is showing to everyone. Is that the case? I'm just going to check. Super, great. All right, so that is where I am going to be taking you on a journey for the next, I guess, 27 minutes, where I am going to, oh, I've gone a little bit too quick, where I'm going to be taking a long route to seeing how we can have a more data-enabled planet and a resource-based economy. Now, the ideas behind this presentation are, in essence, designed to make you think about the effects of technology, but also how technology can better enable the world. And one of the fundamentals of that is something that I like to call ledger networks. Now, I want to start with a definition of a resource-based economy, because it's something that is quite abstract, and it's something that, you know, maybe is only going to exist in 200 years or 500 years. So I'll just read this out. And a resource-based economy is a system which all goods and services are available without the use of money, credit, barter, or any other system of debt or servitude. All resources become the common heritage of the inhabitants and not just a select few. Now, we all know the current system that we live in, and it tends to be called capitalism. And I'm not saying that capitalism is wrong. I'm just trying to say that maybe it's not the best way that we can actually manage, let's say, society. So before I go into this, I want to actually first go into the past before going into the future. And that is because of this super cliche quote that history does not repeat, but it often rhymes. So that's where, if we're looking at waves of kind of innovation, that's where we can see at the current period where we are in 2020, we are moving through what is defined as a turning point. Now, this model what you see in front of you is a simplified version of one that is from someone called Carlota Perez. And if you can see my mouse, what we're seeing the maturity of the previous surge. Now, we're talking about technology and financial capital when we're looking at this model. But what we can see is we have eruption, frenzy, synergy, and maturity, and this turning point. Now, this turning point is what we're going to be talking about specifically later. But first, let's go a little bit more into, you know, really what's happening around the world and go further into the past. The world is more complex than ever. There are so many systems that make sure that you get your food, or that you can use Instagram, or that we're even on this Zoom call right now. And they all use data. And data is the lifeblood of economic development. This is a quote from the EU's recent data strategy, where they single out data and they say it's such a key fundamental aspect of society that it is the lifeblood. And they go in a little bit more depth, and it's a long report, but I just took these two quotes, and they say, over the last few years, digital technologies have all transformed the economy and society, affecting all sectors of activity and the daily lives of all Europeans. And data is the center of this transformation, and more is to come. And I think it's really important that now, again, if we look 10 years in the past and how many people had mobile phones that had all of these amazing applications that were more powerful than spaceships, you know, we're not really, it wasn't really around 10, 20, and most definitely not 30 years ago. And as this, let's say, society and as the way that we use data has got more complex, the data is also moving through more and more systems. And what happens is each of these entities take a cut to effectively verify this data. They then transfer this data. And one of the biggest issues of data management has been the standardization of this data. As we've moved from paper to computers in these hugely complex multicultural environments. You know, data used to be stored in a town hall, maybe in a local village, in a simple book, but now you have companies like Facebook and Google where they have these data that span kind of, you know, the entire world, if you will. And the structure is, as has been through much of society up until this point, has been very much structured like this, where information will move from various entities, it will get audited by a third party, and it will then continue through to its endpoint. And that's where, you know, these entities have arguably quite a lot of power, but we are so used to using them in our daily lives. Maybe MasterCard or Visa, Facebook, iCloud, Zoom, which is something that we're using now. But these have kind of snuck in and become a daily part of, as I mentioned, all of our lives. Okay, Jonathan, I understand you're saying a lot of stuff right now, but I want to take it a step deeper of really like, how does a transaction actually work? Because a transaction is something like a payment, but it's also something like when you send a message to a friend, that arguably is also a data transaction. Or if we look back at Eva's presentation, it's also the transaction of energy in a way. And they move through all these complex processes. And this is one of a payment of cross-border payments, which is, you know, renowned for having high fees and taking advantage of people that don't have a lot anyway, to put it very bluntly. And the reason why these systems are so complex is because data is always untrusted until someone goes and verifies it. And no participant trusts the data until it's been settled. That means it's been verified, and it is agreed that it is a source of truth. But data that is actually representative of someone, but no longer in the physical world, but in this digital world that all of our lives now revolved with, what if that data is actually controlled by someone else? The question then raises, does it need to be this way? Now, a simple definition of data is it's a source of truth. And these sources of truth together can be collected for reference or analysis. But if you can't access large amounts of data or large amounts of sources of truth, then you can't do that reference or analysis. And that's why companies like Bloomberg and other market intelligence firms make so much money, because they're aggregating all of this information. But if we look at, you know, what other technologies have happened or been, you know, in the past that have had such an impact on society, they effectively opened up a new generation of society, the ways of thinking and the way that we interact with the world. Well, if you look at the base technologies where they were kind of taken advantage of or exploited or monopolized, we had big steel, which is made from a raw resource of iron. We have big data, which is made from the raw resource of, big oil, which is made from the raw resource of oil. And now we have big data, which is, you know, the raw resource of us, actually. We are now the raw resource, our consciousness again. So if we look at, you know, how these companies are currently exploiting all of these raw resources right now, we can see that Amazon, Alphabet, Facebook, Alibaba, Tencent, Visa, these are large data companies that effectively help us and facilitate transactions. But in doing so, we're effectively giving them insight and insight into our daily lives. Now, that's where all modern world-changing technology, you know, that have been developed over the last 10 to 20 years that are now coming into fruition, that you and I might know these technologies as, you know, the fourth industrial revolution. And that's where AI interprets data, Internet of Things generates data, artificial and virtual reality allow us to interact with data. But then the question is, okay, well, where is the data management technology? Like, because this is a raw resource, so it needs to be managed. These other technologies aren't managing it. Well, I'm not here to, you know, try and sell you on cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin, but what I want to try and do is open people's eyes to the fundamental technology that's behind these things, which is blockchain, or DLT, which is effectively a ledger. And this here is currently I would, unless someone comes up with something right now, is, you know, the only contender that we have for a true global data management technology. And that is because we're actually forming network ledgers, which is what these are. And I'm going to be going into a little bit more depth. So that's where, again, looking through past, we've gone from bookkeeping, keeping data in books, which is, you know, double entry bookkeeping. If we look at the old financial world, we've then moved over to punch cards, which we used in these huge mainframes. We've then gone to databases, and now we're moving on to the next phase, which is network ledgers. Now, it's important at this point to understand that all of these technologies that we see in front of us, these are all just there to record data, and data is meant to be representative of a transaction, as we saw earlier. But one of the benefits, or some of the benefits of this technology, is there's no longer one entity saying right or wrong, but actually many people are coming together by putting their information on these shared network ledgers. You thus create a shared set of truths. And with a shared set of truths, what it enables is you can start to build and maintain a common understanding of the world. With a common understanding of the world, oh, of course I did this wrong. With a common understanding of the world, that's where we can start to see things like records of ownership, where instead of having them locked up behind lock and key, maybe in a bank, we can have a little bit more transparency, maybe in your local council. We can also have easier access to records of certification, and also more transparent records of transactions. Who did what? When did they do it? So before I go talking a little bit more about blockchain technology, I think, you know, I really want to provide through this presentation the most basic elements of what makes up a network ledger. Well, it's very interesting. Hello? I guess you can hear me still. That's interesting about this is we have rules. Now, rules are kind of the cornerstone of society in the countries that you live in. So for example, for some reason keep on getting muted. A set of rules. Now, if we go into the implementation, that's effectively the US legal system that's implementing the rules that were set in the US Constitution. Now, if we have the network, by deciding that you're going to participate in the US legal system, you are agreeing that that is the correct implementation of that rule set. Now, with blockchain, it's exactly the same. Before you start to use one of these technologies, first a rule set, a set of standards are being built. Then what happens is they go and build the technology and the economic system behind that rule set, which is the implementation. And then you have a network of people that agree that that is the correct implementation of that rule set. So if we look at that base level, now we've all heard of things like Bitcoin and Ethereum, but actually what's interesting is it's not just about the currency. And with those rule sets that I mentioned and the adoption and the networks, what we're starting to see is a split where we have crypto or decentralized finance, but we also have this data management, which is what I really want to try and focus on in this conversation, is that you can effectively be creating a shared set of truths between various parties, and that companies share the control of the network, and there is an increased shared trust in the information. And blockchain adoption is no longer tomorrow. And as you can see here, there's a lot of large numbers that are effectively saying, and I want to focus on the one from Deloitte, where 86% of companies think that blockchain technology is broadly scalable and will eventually achieve mainstream adoption. But Jonathan, where is it? Is blockchain actually being used? Well, just these are 3 recent headlines that are looking at the finance, but in the finance industry, but are very focused on, say, improving the efficiency of these records of transactions. We have $3.3 billion worth of deals. We have $10 billion of private placements that are being put on these private blockchains. And here are some of the logos of companies that are actually really building this technology out. We have JP Morgan, IBM, Coinbase, Santander is a bank that maybe some of you are familiar with, T-Mobile being a huge telecommunications. And these are companies that have identified this technology and said, hey, well, not only is it in, for example, my particular company, but for my entire industry, this is interesting. Now, this here is looking at trade finance, which is, effectively financing the supply chain. And they're using this because in a trade finance transaction, there can be up to 5,000 different data points that are involved, excluding the financial part. So they have to understand and bring together all of this information. And that's where they're working together, actually. There is collaboration on a industry level that arguably technology has never seen before, to effectively create these consortia that will set that rule set that I mentioned, build that technology, and together they are going to form the network that uses it. And here is a graphical representation of the different technologies that some of these companies are actually using. Now, that's where there are Ethereum, which is a public chain, and we have Hyperledger Fabric, which is a private chain, or where a company can have their own version of, for example, Hyperledger Fabric. And that's where we see that not all companies are building private versions, but they're also building these public blockchains. Another element that's interesting is that we have these things that are called stable coins. And no longer do you need to have a dollar cash, but you can have a dollar that is represented in these new blockchain environments that effectively give you access to the same form of economy that you could with your standard cash. But now you actually have access to potentially even more options than you did before. I'm going to go quite quickly through this. But that's where one of the elements that's most interesting, and one of the developments that I think everyone should be paying attention to, is one of central bank digital currencies. And that's where only over the last, I would say, 6 months have more and more news reports coming out, and only over the last 2 weeks is this becoming really serious. But we now have confirmed reports that these 4 countries, the digital dollar being the US, the People's Bank of China being China, Europe being Europe, and India being India, all of their central banks are effectively considering the idea of a central bank digital currency, which is representative of almost half the world's population that may soon have easy access to this quote unquote digital currency. Now, there are ethical conditions to be taken into consideration with the adoption of this technology, but I'm not going to be covering those today. So, Jonathan, great. We have 10 minutes left in this presentation. You just sold me on the idea that we're in this transition period and that blockchain technology is the new data management technology. Why should I give a shit? Well, that is because data, as I mentioned, is a core part of the way that we operate now as a society, but the data layer is not working for us. It is effectively taking advantage of us as people that are the raw producers of this element. And so that's where the traditional economy and the way that things have been structured up until now, they are consisting of dumb assets where there is trust enabled by a third party, which causes information asymmetry, and arguably of an organization. I was speaking with someone on the phone today, and they said if their company moves from the traditional economy to the digital economy, potentially up to 75% of the workers within that company would no longer be necessary, because that 75% focuses on creating trust and auditing a lot of this information. But if a blockchain is doing that by default, hey, maybe that's something that's interesting. So we have in the digital economy, because these assets are effectively native to the environment that they're in, because they are for the first time ever truly digital, We then have trust by network consensus, which is creating those shared set of truths that I was talking about. And we have information symmetry. Now, I know I'm going quite fast here, but the reality is this data layer transition, has already been a lot of activity, and we are now in this period of crossing the chasm, where the early majority, which might be you on this conference today, or it might be a company that you're engaged with, or your financial institution, or maybe even your energy provider, are now really seriously considering how they're going to cross this chasm. And we're going to move from a system that looks much like this to a system that looks much like this. And this here is probably the most, it just crashed. Great. That's how these things are supposed to happen, right? I hope you're all still following me, because I know this is a lot of information. So here, if this is the current system, if this is going to be the future system that we're looking at, what we're effectively going to see is the current economy that manages the world, that manages the economy, that manages the food that you and I eat, that manages the energy, the assets that are contained within this economy, and the digital economy, which is over here, which currently consists of 200 to 220 billion over the last couple of days, is we're going to effectively have this transition moment from the traditional economy to this digital economy. Now, what's interesting about this is in networks, there is something called Metcalfe's law. And that's where the value of the network, or the value of what's stored on that network, is proportional to the value of the participants of the network. So because you get this exponential effect, you effectively get to this crossover point that's represented here. Now, with what's going on around the world with COVID, obviously I'm in the blockchain ecosystem, but what's happening is blockchain, the adoption is being sped up, because people are realizing that we need to have better data on how we're managing the resources that the earth is providing for us. And this takes us into what's possible in the future. Because we're now in this transition moment, and if we look again at the history of where we've been before, we are now slap bang in the middle of this turning point. Now, this is an entire book that talks about how these systems develop, but for this turning point, it's very interesting that there are two things that are required. The first one is regulation, and the second one is the understanding and the perspective shift. From the first perspective, regulatory, it's starting to happen faster and faster, where the EU is effectively speeding up their processes of trying to regulate this technology, and understanding and perspective is the reason why I'm here, basically. And what's important about this, and then I get to talk a little bit about why this is even more important, is we're starting to move data out of these silos. And we're creating more secure and transparent data environments. And that raises the question, if data is more open and it's easier for companies, governments, and maybe even you as a consumer to start to audit the environments and the goods that you're buying, it's about to get a lot easier to start to understand how things move around the world, answering questions like, what really does happen to my data? Or where does my food actually come from? Or what was the carbon footprint of this product that I'm now buying in H&M? And what this causes is a simpler world caused by the simplification of accessing and computing on sources of truth. It brings more transparency, and some of you may be thinking that are more familiar with blockchain, well, what about private blockchain solutions? Well, yeah, but that doesn't mean that people can still get access to them, where you can still have an overview and understand some of the elements that are happening inside it. But that's where regulation can also tie into those private chains to enforce, that they're tracking things like climate impact on the goods that they're selling. And one of the most important points is the accessibility of finance, and leading to things like universal basic finance. So one of the key areas that's happening right now is in this financial industry. But the reason why that is so pivotal is finance tends to finance the technological development. And what we're starting to get is these various other use cases of the technology that I can point you in the direction of actual use cases and the real world rolling out of the applications of this technology in each of these sub-industries or use cases, as I mentioned. Now, this effectively causes more interoperability, which will have this knock-on effect, which will, effectively speed up the entire process, where I hope that we get to that crossover point that I mentioned from Metcalfe's law. And that's where, if we take Gartner's hype cycle of what's happening, is we're now on this slope of enlightenment. And this is the final part of the presentation, and I hope this is what you get to take away from this, is as humanity relies more and more on technology, the data fundamentally underpinning that technology must be trusted. Because now we don't only exist in the physical world, but we also exist in the digital world. But the digital world does not exist to control the physical world, but to actually enable it. And that's where effective resource management, as I mentioned about the resource-based economy at the very beginning, should be the aim of arguably society, because there's only X amount of resources that can provide for a population that is, still growing every single day. So that's where the way it's structured is the physical world provides information to the digital world, which then provides services to the physical world. I'm getting a message. I almost have over. So that's where, if technology requires data and the amount of data that is inside this digital world, we have to be careful as we're putting more information into it. But the consequence, if we do it in the right way, will lead to better services in the physical world, which can provide to a society of one like Ava you were talking about. So the closing statements are, we all want a simplification of the world, and we're approaching the synergy phase of this technology. And the question that I'd like to leave you with is, what are the potential effects of better managed resources and more efficiency on the job market, innovation, and most importantly, considering the time that we're in, the future of humanity? Thank you very much. I hope you got something out of that. I know it was also a lot. I guess if there's time for any questions, I'm happy to hear it.